Hello, everyone. Good morning to you all. We're happy that you've joined us this morning for this webinar. This is part of the Literacy for Leaders webinar series, and some of you I know have attended more than one of these. This is number 4. Today, we're going to focus on vocabulary, and all of the resources that we're going to be using, accessing, referencing throughout today's webinar are located at that QR code if you want to scan that, or the bit.ly. So that bit.ly is also here on the slide. You can simply open a browser window, type in that bit.ly URL, and it will take you into a Padlet where you'll see resources for prior webinars and the resources that we'll be using today. And then we're going to kind of get started here with some introductions this morning, so you know who's supporting this webinar series and today's learning. So I want to take just a moment, introduce our Office of Early Learning team here. You'll see those shining faces here. We're here on the display as well as on the slide. Hello, I'm Donna Albaugh. I am one of the Office of Early Learning consultants here. I work in the Sandhills region, so my Sandhills friends, thanks for being with. Presenting here as well, we have Cynthia Barber. She represents Northwest region. We have Kelly Pratt. She's in the Western region. And then behind the scenes today, you're going to see us Q&A, the chat, the polls, all of those things are being facilitated. Candace is helping with that, the Southeast region. And then the person who's trying to think through how we keep moving through this slide content and moving it forward is Dr. Angela Preston. I just want to thank my team. It's a wonderful team to work with, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with this group. This slide lets you know that, we're on number 4 here. It is January 24th, 2023. How did that happen already? But here we are. We're going to talk about vocabulary, and then the next webinar and the final webinar in the series will occur on March 7th. Just a reminder to all of you, and you all know this if you've been here repeatedly, each webinar is a separate registration link, so you'll need to register for that, and Candace has placed that information so you can get registered. All right, so that kind of gives you some logistics for today. Here is our agenda. So, these are some of the things we want to cover with you all today. We've stayed consistently, embedded in evidence-based practices. We know that the science of reading has the research to support the work we're doing. We're aligning our practices, those evidence-based practices, to the science of reading to ensure that we're supporting every child as they are developing literacy skills. So effective implementation, we'll tap into that again, which we've done consistently, and provide some resources. And then, of course, we're going to continually tap back into how do I create that enabling context to ensure that folks have what they need to do this work. So that's kind of like an overview. Lastly, we're going to wrap up with some next steps as we think forward and prepare for March 7th. And now we're going to do what we've done so far most every webinar, I think. It's a poll time. We're just trying to figure out who's in the room today. So what's your role at the district level? Are you an administrator at the district level, school administrator, coach, teacher, or some other role that you play? All righty then. So it looks like 17 of us are administrative level, about 25 of us are actually school level admins. 40 of us are in a coaching role for classroom teachers, and 18 of us are other. And then we have some no responses. So yeah, so we've got a good mix of participants here for different roles. But at the end of the day, all of us are in a role of supporting and helping get those science of reading practices that are aligned, those evidence-based practices, embedded in the way we do the work of helping children learn to read. We're going to continue to make sure that you have some resources that are supportive, connections. Have you had a chance to use or share self-reflection tools? So when you think about this next question, it's a yes or a not yet response. Have you had a chance to share some of these resources? So look what we've got today. 61 of us have actually shared, looked at M-Class data, reviewed that data, and have shared these resources. So I'm real 61 of us. Thank you for that, everybody. If not, it's not too late. We're going to keep pushing out these resources and sharing ways that you can access them, because we know they're important resources for us to use. So when you see the brain in the top right corner, We want you to be cognizant of that and pay attention. You have seen this Scarborough's rope and the simple view of reading formula on many occasions. We're going to kind of use them as a framework for today's content. We know that this reading rope identifies both critical components of language comprehension and decoding. So how are we getting at word recognition skills, that decoding piece? Today, we're going to be kind of transitioning away from word recognition, is what we've covered in the prior 3 webinars. And today, we're going to transition more into that language comp piece. So remember, even though we're focusing primarily on word recognition in the past so far, we're going to teach both, we're going to teach both word recognition and language comp skills in order to create or support skilled reading. So again, today we're focused on that language comp piece. So I'm going to turn the session over now. We're talking about vocabulary, and Cynthia is going to lead you through some content.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you this morning. And we're going to start by looking at some evidence-based practices. If you were with us for the last session, you'll remember that we talked about evidence-based practices for phonics instruction. And today we're going to focus on what science really tells us about vocabulary and vocabulary instruction. So let's dig a little bit deeper into vocabulary and how we actually acquire vocabulary, and some instructional practices will come toward the end of this. So let's do a little bit of orienting to some models. Donna talked a lot about Scarborough's rope, and we've talked quite a bit about Scarborough's rope in our previous sessions, but we wanted to bring in the 4-part processor. Many of you, if you've been in letters, then you are very familiar with the 4-part processing system. This model really illustrates how our brain both decodes words and works to understand the words that we read. These processes we know work together, but we know they're not linear. Everything fires together. All parts of the brain are activated when we look at a word, decode a word, and try to determine the meaning of that word. So for example, in a very simple word like bat, we see the word and we process the letters. We hear the sounds in our head and we may process it as 3 separate sounds. B-at. We may process it as an onset and rhyme, or we may process it as the entire word. But we cannot process the meaning of the word bat without context, because our language is very rich and deep. Many of our words have multiple meanings. So even in a very simple word like bat, we need the context in order to assign the correct meaning to that word. So for this session, we're going to really focus and hone in on the meaning processor and how the meaning processor works with the context processor to bring meaning to what is read. There is also a great video that we linked in your Padlet that illustrates how words are stored in semantic maps within the brain. And I really encourage you to watch this video as it offers fascinating information on the latest research. It is truly a fascinating video, so I certainly encourage you to watch that video. So let's take a couple of minutes and really define what is vocabulary. Let's start by establishing kind of that common working definition of vocabulary. We know vocabulary is essentially our knowledge of and our memory for word meanings. So we took this definition from your letters manual, and you can see our reference there. We know that it also builds from receptive to expressive use in our language. So let's dig a little bit deeper into those 2 pieces, receptive and expressive language. So you can see on the screen, we've illustrated receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary and how those 2 things come together in your mental dictionary or your lexicon. So receptive vocabulary is what is in your head. Almost every person has a larger receptive vocabulary than expressive vocabulary. We have a storehouse of word meanings that we use to comprehend what is said, and as we get older, what is read, and what we interpret in what we read. So we really do start developing receptive vocabulary at a very young age. So for example, think of a baby that points at a dog when you say, "Do you see the doggy?" So before they can even say dog, they understand that doggy means dog. And so another way to think about receptive language is if you have ever tried to learn a foreign language. We often understand words that we hear when spoken slowly or read in simple text before we can recall them and use them in conversation in our own writing. When you think about receptive vocabulary, think of the words that you understand when you're listening or when you're reading. Now, when we think about expressive vocabulary, that requires a deeper level of understanding than just recognizing a word in the context of written or spoken language. So, when a word becomes part of your expressive vocabulary, it demonstrates true ownership of the word. Word knowledge really exists on a continuum of I have kind of no idea what this word means to I know what that word means and I can use it in my own writing or I can use it in my own conversation. So let's like a little bit more or think a little bit more about that. So in order to move a word from your receptive vocabulary into your expressive vocabulary, the word has to move from our phonological lexicon, which is where we store words that we have heard before and recognize phonologically, to our semantic lexicon, which is how our brain stores word meanings and makes connections between words like synonyms and related mental concepts, which was demonstrated or will be demonstrated in the video that I highly encourage you to watch. It talks about our brain dictionaries. So when you think of your semantic lexicon, think of that mental dictionary there that stores all the meanings for words that you know. One thing to consider also when you think about assessing vocabulary is to think about the impact that decoding has on vocabulary skills. So, for example, if you have a child that has poor decoding skills, you'd want to maybe think about giving them an oral assessment of vocabulary to ferret out vocabulary knowledge versus that ability to decode the word. So that's just something to consider as you think about that. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about direct and indirect vocabulary instruction. We're going to first define these terms, and then we're going to look more closely at the aspect at each aspect of vocabulary learning. All right. So when we think about vocabulary instruction, we want to first think about how many word meanings do we really need students to have? Let's start with what students come to us with. The average student really enters kindergarten with about 4,000 root words. For example, the student may know the root word bake. That can be linked to other morphological variations like bakes or baked or baking or baker. So we also know, unfortunately, that kindergarten students sometimes come to us with from a less language rich environment. We know that we see a large spectrum of abilities coming into kindergarten. And some of you may be aware and familiar with a 1995 study from Hart and Risley called Meaningful Differences. And they really explore in that study the gaps in vocabulary that many of our students are coming to school with. That video is also linked in your Padlet, and I encourage you to watch that video that will just elaborate more on the study if you're not familiar with that study. But we know that the average student will continue to learn between 800 and 1,000 new word meanings per year through about sixth grade. And that kind of breaks down to, in the primary grade, students learning about 10 words per week in depth through direct vocabulary instruction. So if we do the math a little bit, just to break it down further, we can take an average of about 900 words we want our students, if we need them to learn between 800 and 1,000 words, if we take the average of about 900, we can divide that into about 36 weeks of instruction during the school year. And so that breaks down to about 25 words per week. So we said in the slide prior that students can typically be taught anywhere between 8 and 10 vocabulary words in depth through direct vocabulary instruction. So where do the other words come from? Well, the remainder of the words really come through learning indirect vocabulary, words that we learn through other aspects of language. So let's take a few minutes and let's focus on and really define direct versus indirect vocabulary learning. Okay, we're going to first define those two terms, and then we're going to dive into some direct instruction. Although a great deal of vocabulary is really learned indirectly some vocabulary we know should be taught directly. Direct instruction helps our students learn difficult words such as words that represent complex concepts that are not necessarily part of the student's everyday experiences. And direct instruction of vocabulary when it's relevant to a given text or something that you're reading, which will lead to better comprehension. Okay. So in the primary grades, we really want to focus on about 10 words per week taught in depth, and the rest are typically going to be learned informally through exposure during listening and reading, which is where we'll dive into that indirect experience. But we're going to focus on first some of our direct learning practices. So teachers can teach a few hundred words thoroughly using direct, planned, explicit teaching of words. So direct instruction, really, the first one is teaching specific words before reading. So we want to provide students with instruction in specific words that are important to students' content learning or understanding of a particular text. We want to teach students more general word learning strategies that they can apply to a variety of words when they're analyzing words. So, for example, one of our principles of instruction is morphology and morphemes or root words. That can also build their toolbox for indirect vocabulary instruction. Teaching specific words before reading helps vocabulary learning, and it also helps reading comprehension. So before the students read a text, we know that it's often helpful to teach them specific words that they'll see in the text that are particularly important to helping them understand what the text is meaning. So teaching that important vocabulary before reading can really help them learn new words, but also assist in comprehension. We also want to provide instruction over an extended period of time to encourage students to use vocabulary in different contexts, in both spoken experiences and in written communication. So again, remember, when students can use that word in their writing, it's a sign that they own that word, that it is really part of their mental lexicon. We know that children learn words best when they're provided with instruction over that extended period of time, and when that instruction has them actively working with and using the words. And so, for example, using new words in their writing and using them in class conversation and giving them multiple experiences with that word will help them move that word into their long-term memory. The more students use new words, the more they use them in different contexts, the more likely they are to learn those words. So that leads us to offering those repeated exposures in many different contexts. So students learn new words best when they encounter them often and in various contexts. So the more the child sees the word, hears the word, works with a specific word, the better they learn that word. And when we provide those extended instructional experiences that promote that active engagement and give students repeated exposure to words, they read those words, they see them in text, that increased exposure just, again, moves that word into their long-term memory. So exposure in many different contexts gives them a deeper understanding of the word and how it's likely to be used. So for instance, miserly and thrifty are both adjectives that describe a person who avoids spending money. But thrifty has a more positive connotation than miserly. And I think this plays a particularly important role when we're thinking about using vocabulary in their writing. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about it when we're thinking about older students as well. We know that letters, many of us have already completed our letters or are in the midst of completing our letters professional development. So here you're going to see an example of explicitly teaching vocabulary prior to reading. So this is one strategy that comes directly from letters and shows you how you can directly teach words in depth every single week. This is an initial introduction to the word that is really fast paced. It follows the I do, we do, you do, gradual release of responsibility. So here's a very quick example that will follow those steps a little bit. We want to pronounce the word, write the word, and read the word. So we might use the word dashed. We would write the word and spell it as we write it, ask the students to respond. What is the word? The students respond dash. we want to provide a student-friendly definition of the word. So we want to just tell the students what the word means. So I might say something like dashed means to cover a short distance quickly. And then we want to say more about the word. So if I were using this word, if I pulled this out of a text that we were reading, I might go back to the text and contextualize the word by reading the sentence from the text for which the word I pulled. So for example, if the sentence was, he dashed past his secretary and grabbed the phone. So I might read that, and then I would ask the students questions about the word to elicit more word use. So I might ask the students to talk about a time they might have to dash somewhere in order not to be late. And so the power and of that strategy is students get to talk about the word and they learn the word more deeply. So if they already knew the word, they add to what they already know, and if they didn't, it gives them some information about that word. So that's a very quick, simple lesson plan format to introduce a word from letters. How do you actually select vocabulary words to teach? We know, how do you make the most of that direct vocabulary instruction? We know that teachers can't teach every single word that students don't know. So we have to be very intentional about selecting some vocabulary. So we're going to see a very quick video here in just a second by Dr. Isabel Beck about vocabulary instruction. And you might be familiar with much of her work. It comes from bringing words to life and robust vocabulary instruction. And so she's going to talk a little bit about her thought process when she thinks about selecting words to teach. And then we're going to dive a little bit into that tiered instruction.
What does vocabulary instruction look like? What should it look like?
Well, you would see little kids or not so little kids learning very interesting words, sophisticated words, what's called tier 2 words, what some of us will call hard words. They're low frequency words in oral language. They appear in printed language, in written text. So that's what you'd see, traces of that. You'd see them talking about the word. You'd see them trying to distinguish whether one use of the word, example of a word, was a good one and one was not. You'd see them trying to develop a situation that would use the word. So you'd see lots of interesting talk and directed talk about a word, a sophisticated word.
Give us an example, like from corduroy, if you can remember one.
Oh,
I
well,
bet you've
yeah.
read it a lot of times.
Well, corduroy is a special one that I like because early in a program of research, my colleague Mark McCown and I used to go out to kindergartens and first grades and read stories to kids, and then afterwards pull out a couple of the words. And one would read and the other one would take notes. So I was reading A Pocket for Corduroy to a kindergarten class, and we'd gone through it, stopped and asked some questions. And afterwards I said, so one of the words in the story was reluctant. Do you remember Lisa was reluctant to leave her teddy bear in the laundromat? I'm reluctant to ride a roller coaster, so I tried to expand the use of it. Some children are reluctant to eat spinach. Could you tell me something you'd be reluctant to do? And one said, I'd be reluctant to leave my teddy bear in the laundromat. And I went, just like Lisa. Could you tell me, and that's what they will do. Could you tell me something that is not like Lisa? I'd be reluctant to leave my teddy bear in the supermarket. Oh, yeah, that's different. Then went on until finally I'd be reluctant to leave my drums. This was right after Christmas at my friend's house. And then it clicked in my head that reluctant means having something to do with leaving something. If I said, could you tell me something that you'd be reluctant to do that has nothing to do with leaving anything? And I probably got the best answer I've ever gotten from kindergarten through doctoral programs. And this little 5-year-old raised her hand and said, I'd be reluctant to change a baby's diaper.
I always get a little chuckle from watching that video. But that just goes through, I think she does a great job of talking about vocabulary and how you can really encourage vocabulary learning through conversation with students. When we think about selecting vocabulary words to teach, we know that words have different levels of utility, and there are many considerations when it comes to selecting the words that we teach. There are a few things that teachers need to think about when they are looking at which words they're going to teach directly. So when you think about those words, we want to think about basic words. We want to think about high frequency words. Are my students familiar with those? When you think about those basic words, you want to consider, do you have lots of multilingual learners in your classroom? We also want to think about, are there content words or low frequency words, as we would call them. We also want to consider thinking about the grade level. And is it grade level appropriate? We want to consider things like their background and their experiences and what are they coming into this learning situation with. What's the content or the knowledge topic that we're really focusing on? And we want to really think about what are the most useful words to select that are going to help the students understand the text that we're presenting to them. The next couple of slides are going to really talk about how do we choose the best words for direct instruction. So you see our cake over here that really illustrates that tiered vocabulary instruction. There are so many words in the English language. How do we know which words that we need to teach? Well, we kind of think about that as a piece of cake. So let's talk about each tier a little bit. We know that tier 1 words are common everyday words that we use in conversation. These words are typically known by everyone, and we know from our language learning that they're often derived from the Anglo-Saxon layer of language, and we know that these words can sometimes be difficult for spelling because they don't always follow those phonological conventions. So, for example, you see the word come. It doesn't follow that typical phonological convention, and it is a tier 1 word. It doesn't really require instruction. It's one of those words that most everyone knows. Now, tier 2 vocabulary words, those are more academic words. So they're high frequency words that really occur across context. We know these words are often derived from the Latin layer of language, and they have nuanced meanings often. They're sometimes the meaning is more abstract, so it's a little bit harder to define. So here's an example, words like hilarious, endure, despise, arrange. These are the words we want to really target for explicit vocabulary instruction. Now, when we think about the tier 3 words or the top tier of our cake, these are typically content words. They're content area words, they're low frequency, and they typically occur in a specific domain. When we think about that, they're best learned in the context of a lesson or a subject matter. So we really want to focus our attention on those words when we're reading text. When we're reading, those words are usually defined within the text. So we want to teach the students to use that text to glean the meaning of that word. So we also know that these tier 3 words are typically words that are derived from the Greek layer of language, and we know that they typically only have one specific meaning. Let's think about how that impacts the words that we are selecting to teach. So let's look at a few different words. So I have lots of words here. It's my vocabulary list. So knowing that we cannot directly teach every one of these words, right? Let's see if we can identify the tier in which the word belongs. So we're going to do a little waterfall or chatterfall, as we like to call it. So I'm going to call out a word, and I just want you to put in the chat, is it a tier 1 word, a tier 2, or a tier 3 word? Okay, so we're just going to do 3 little examples and get a little bit of practice. So the first word is economics. Would that be a tier 1 word, a tier 2 word, or a tier 3 word? Very good. I'm seeing lots of tier 3 words. Great. Thank you. The next one is realize. I see lots of tier 2s coming in the chat. So yes, we would say that realize would be a tier 2 word. And the last word is star. Star. Would that be a 1, 2, or 3? Yes, I see lots of 1. So star is a very familiar word that most students will know the meaning of. It's mostly in their vocabulary. So we may just want to enrich the meaning of that word. You're going to see that we actually grouped our vocabulary words. So you see that our tier 1 words, the ones that are highlighted in green. And our tier 2 words are the ones we highlighted in orange, words like slump and decide and glance and regret and trust, realize, hero, and bother. So those are words we would focus on for direct instruction. And then the last set of words, those are our tier 3 words. Those are highlighted in blue. So again, those are words that typically only have one distinct meaning, and we typically want to teach those in the context of what we are reading. So as a last word about vocabulary instruction, our direct instruction really should focus on those tier 2 words because they enrich our students' vocabulary. This is just a helpful lens to help us really think through which words do I need to directly instruct. So let's dive in to some indirect vocabulary. Let's talk a little bit about that and build up some background knowledge about indirect vocabulary instruction. So although, again, a lot of vocabulary is taught directly, much of our vocabulary is learned through indirect learning experiences. So those indirect learning experiences provide students with oral language, written language experiences, and they allow the students to learn the words through incidental instruction, words that are interesting to students or words that come up in conversation with students. So let's think a little bit about that indirect 3 principles of how you would learn words indirectly. We know that children learn the meanings of most words indirectly through those everyday experiences with oral language and with written language. We know that children learn word meanings indirectly in 3 different ways, typically. So first of all, they engage in daily oral language. So we know that young children learn word meanings through conversations with people, especially with the adults that are in front of them, who are their caregivers, or as they come to school through their teachers. And so as they engage in these conversations, they often hear adults repeat words several different times, and they may hear adults use new words and interesting words. So the more oral language experience the children have, the more word meanings that they learn indirectly through that back and forth conversation. And again, I'll reference the Hart and Risley study. If you go back and look at that video or go back and read through that study, they really talk a lot about that exchange, building up vocabulary for young students. So another way they learn vocabulary words indirectly is really listening to adults read to them. So we talk a lot about, for very young children, how important it is to read to them. They listen to us. So they learn word meanings from that read aloud, and it's particularly helpful when the reader pauses during the reading to define an unfamiliar word. And then we go back during and after the reading to engage in conversation about the book, and we reference those words. So we know that as teachers and instructors, we look at that read aloud experience as a very rich place to pull in some vocabulary. Conversations about books really do help children learn new words. They help them think about new concepts that are related to prior knowledge and experiences and really just build that up. And we know that from research that children's books really typically contain more unusual and sophisticated words or new vocabulary words than really that everyday conversation, even the everyday conversation of well-educated adults. So one reason why reading aloud to children is so important is that it really increases that exposure to new vocabulary. And it really provides them with a language of books that we do not use in our oral conversation. The last way we want to think about that indirect vocabulary learning is when students become readers. And so they master the code and they really begin reading extensively on their own. They may learn new vocabulary words on their own. So the more the child reads, the more new words they're going to encounter and the more word meanings they're going to learn. So think about that. Since children learn the most words indirectly, how can we foster this indirect learning in the classroom? We want to really think about that piece. A couple of different ways we want to do that is creating that language-rich environment, but that really requires intentionally thinking about these aspects of word learning and really creating opportunities for students to add to their lexicon or that storehouse of word knowledge. So let's elaborate a little bit in the next few slides. We're going to elaborate on these 3 things. So the first thing is really creating an environment where student learning can flourish. So establishing that environment of sophisticated oral language. So when we look at research and we think about a study that was done by the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 2012, the way teachers speak and use direct language directly affects the student's vocabulary. So specifically, when we think about that, the number of unusual words used by the teacher was more important than the sheer number of words spoken. So thinking also about fostering discourse with students. So again, that back and forth exchange rather than just talking at them helps to promote that vocabulary growth. So researchers conclude that we can consider ways to support that classroom language interaction through extended conversation or extended discourse. So when we think about that, we think about that in practice and we're looking at classrooms as we're walking through our building, think about teacher talk versus student talk. Is the teacher using advanced vocabulary in the classroom, but also is it that back and forth reciprocal conversation? So when we think about upper grade classrooms, we also want to think about using descriptive language. So instead of saying something like the music teacher is sick today, we might say there are a vast number of germs during the season and your music teacher has strep throat. Therefore, you'll have a substitute teacher as your instructor today in music class. So again, that gives them much more language than just saying the music teacher is sick today and is out. So we also want to think about using sophisticated language when we're discussing a text, especially that read aloud that we bring in. Again, also rephrasing a student's response is another good way to add some sophistication to that language. So for example, a teacher might say, "Can you say what an archaeologist does?" And the student might say, "They dig stuff up, they find stuff." So I might rephrase that and say, yes, an archaeologist digs for or excavates long buried artifacts for examination. And we learn invaluable lessons about history through this process of excavating these artifacts. So again, it just expands the student's response and gives them additional language. Another way to establish that oral language environment is really fostering an environment of word consciousness. So individuals like words and show an awareness of the usage of words when we foster that word consciousness. And we can promote this in our classrooms and in our schools, all kinds of different ways. There's a few on your screen: selecting words of the day to use throughout the day, assigning students as a language detective or a word wizard or a hotshot, which we'll see later. And their job is really to notice different ways that people express similar words, similar thoughts or words. And then we can do some things like implementing a reward system for using magic words, creating the words we know bulletin board. So really just giving them that language rich environment. Another way that we add to their toolbox of indirect vocabulary instruction is giving them that toolbox for independent learning. We're going to expose them to a broad oral and independent reading opportunity and give them that toolbox for learning those words independently. So remember, these are independent learning strategies, and they assume that students can adequately decode the words in the text independently. Students need to learn more words independently than the teacher can possibly teach directly. So there are a few different things that we think about. We think about teaching them to use context. Teachers really should teach students how to use context to determine the meaning of an unknown word so that they can do this in their own reading. However, we know that using context to decipher words meanings is most useful if students are taught to use a dictionary and analyze morphemes or word parts in conjunction with the context. So we want to teach that morphology in conjunction with context, okay? And that brings us to analyzing those word parts. So we know that morphemes, when we think of morphemes, I think of M&Ms because I think morpheme equals meaning. So morphemes are meaningful word parts. And some examples of morphemes are things like compound words, inflectional endings, base words, suffixes, prefixes, roots, Latin, plurals. All of those are morphological elements. So when teachers teach students to recognize and analyze those word parts, then students can use that knowledge along with the context to better determine the meaning of a word. So again, recognizing prefixes and suffixes and root words can be very helpful, but we know nothing is a foolproof strategy for figuring out the meaning of a word. So for example, the word mistletoe doesn't actually contain the prefix mis, and the word matchless does not only mean without a match, it can also mean superior or without equal. So again, no strategy is foolproof. And the last one we would suggest is maybe using some dictionary resources appropriately. So maybe after or during a reading. So we know that students have access to online dictionaries, and the advantage to using those kinds of things is that if they come to a word they don't know or have never seen before, you can figure out how it's pronounced, and so you can add different things to that. Dictionary use, when appropriate, gives them just another tool in their toolbox. So the last thing we're going to talk about in relation to that indirect vocabulary instruction is to provide practice in the classroom. And we want to provide opportunities to review those previously taught words in speaking and writing. So again, revisiting word parts in that is a way to help them truly own the word and truly move that word into their long-term memory. So providing activities to review those previously known words in speaking activities and in writing activities. So in speaking, this can be accomplished in many different ways. They might partner to talk about certain previously learned words, use them in context. And again, this would only be happening after the word has been encountered by the students in lots of different structured contexts, and many different examples of the word have been given. And again, this is an activity that you want the teacher to monitor, provide feedback concerning how the students are using the word. When we think about using those words in writing, one way is to use the Frayer model or the 4 square box activity. And this can be done again in many different ways, from using pictures in the primary grades to using lots of text in the other ways in other grades. But you put the word in the center of the paper and you have students define the word. They can add examples, non-examples, draw pictures and characteristics. So lots of different ways they can practice those words in their writing. So now let's talk about some key principles of vocabulary instruction. So what are some things that you might see as you're walking through your building, or some things you would hope to see or would encourage your teachers to implement? And we're thinking about building up vocabulary. These key principles of effective vocabulary teaching come from Tim Shanahan, and he wrote a blog post and provided these 5 key principles that really guide some vocabulary instruction. So in the next few slides, we're going to provide some examples of ways to support each principle and some activities that you might see occurring in a classroom, or activities that you might encourage your teachers to use. Now, again, the original blog post is also linked in your Padlet. So it's 5 things every teacher should know about vocabulary instruction. And so the first principle that we're going to focus on is focusing on rich meanings, not just dictionary definitions. And so one way to focus on helping students develop rich meanings through direct instruction is to create ownership of the word by having them develop a Frayer model. So in this model, we see characteristics, we see non-essential characteristics, we see examples and non-examples. Again, this can really be adapted for primary grades, where you have them draw pictures rather than using lots of different words. You can complete this as a whole class activity with your students as well, if you're really focusing on some direct words for direct instruction. And again, there's some resources that will be linked to support that, creating ownership through using that Frayer model. And that's a pretty widely known strategy. Another example is emphasizing the connections among words. So this activity can be a very interactive activity where you actually put words on cards, and you have students line up across the room and put themselves in order. And then all the other students or the audience, they ask questions of them, like why did they put themselves in that order? And as long as the students can justify their answer, the learning is really in the discussion. Another way that you can use the semantic gradient is really having them work in pairs to place words, which we're going to see in a video in a second. But you might ask a question, where would you place these words, race and dart, on our semantic gradient, and have them discuss why they would put those words there. The next slide is really going to show you a video of some students working through a semantic gradient. And again, the power of this activity is really in the questioning and the thinking that the students are doing together.
Instructions and supplies have been handed out. Allow the students to work independently, either in small groups or individually.
It feels like it's in the middle to me. Yeah. Tiny is kind of like this fingernail. Like this. Tiny is like a freckle. Like a freckle button. I know, I have many. So tiny should go there, and then microscopic, you can't even see it. So it's like a virus or a germ. Yeah, so it goes here. So it goes all at the end.
Check in on students' progress and guide them when they get stuck or ask for help.
So you guys were asking me about the words and telling me you're a little bit stuck. I have a couple questions for you. We're talking first about what you know for sure. Can you tell me what you know for sure?
That enormous is the biggest one, so it goes all the way at the end.
Okay.
And tiny is the littlest one.
Okay, so let's think about, do you first of all know what all of these words mean?
Small means
Encourage students to discuss the subtle differences among the words and their rationale for how they arrange them on the continuum.
then tiny.
Can you show it to me? Show me small.
Like
So small is definitely down here.
like this glue stick is
That's
so
small. So slide it down. You're sure about that? Is small bigger than tiny?
Yes.
Brian, do you agree? Is small bigger than tiny? Okay, so tiny's all the way down, then small. What's average?
I think average is like right in the middle.
Average is right in the middle. Okay, so if you're looking at this strip, where do you think average would go?
We should put it in the middle.
Maybe just try it. Slide it over a little bit. We'll put it in the middle. So these are the ones we know for sure up here. What about this word? Brian, read this word to me. Help your partner out. What is this word?
Microscopic.
Microscopic. Do you know what microscopic means?
I think it means like when you look inside of a microscope, there's something tiny in there.
You just said something that's very key. What did you just say? When you look in a microscope, there's something very tiny. So where do you think microscopic goes? Okay, tell me why.
Because very tiny is smaller than the tiny.
Very tiny is smaller than tiny. So if this is, let's put them on the strip now.
Wrap up the strategy.
All right. Again, I hope that video just showed you the power of the conversation that can happen between the students and then the students and the teacher. A last way to really focus on shades of meaning or word gradients or semantic gradients is to use paint chips. It just provides another target. You can provide a target word and then have the students really create a semantic gradient. So this is also a great way to enhance the words students use in their writing. So for example, if students are using said over and over in their writing, you can do a semantic gradient or a shades of meaning that can help them find a different word to use in their writing. So here's an example. We'll click in one example. Antonio was happy after running the race because he beat his best time. So is there a better word that we can utilize in that sentence? And they can pick from the semantic gradient. Okay. So the next principle that we really think about is just another way to help students use words and to put them in semantic categories is the strategy of list, group, label. So here's a quote from Reading Rockets. Categorizing listed words through grouping and labeling helps them organize new concepts in relation to previously learned concepts. So you're going to see in the video them working through this process. This really supports storing words in long-term memory. So we're going to watch this short video as the teacher guides them through this process. Brainstorm some other words that come to your mind when you think about gardens. Bella?
Leaves.
Leaves. Savion?
Minerals.
Minerals.
Once there is a nice long list of words, it's time for step 2, grouping.
Now it's time to group these words. I'm going to think about these words and think about how I might put them together if I wanted to cluster them. So the first one I'm going to put on this list is soil. I'm going to put it here. Soil. And let me think of some other words that go with the word soil. I'm going to put sunshine because I'm thinking about things that plants need, soil and sunshine. Let me look at the list and see what else plants need. Water. I'm going to put water over there too. There's no right or wrong answer.
I'm just kind of thinking about it. As long as I can explain why I put those words together, then they go together. Who can think of another word that they might want to group together? Virginia?
I think tomatoes and lettuce and roses should go together.
Tell me why.
Because they all come out of the ground.
The third and final step is labeling the groupings with headers. These titles should be related to the reasoning behind each cluster of words.
I'm going to write a little header here that says what? What should I say? You just said it pretty perfectly. What should I write?
Things that come out of the ground.
You can see that in that video example, the power of the learning comes from the guided and intentional discussion around those vocabulary words. So again, promoting the uses of words and then grouping those words together. The fourth principle that we're going to illustrate and talk a little bit about, teaching students to analyze word parts, is a big part of vocabulary instruction, particularly as students master that word recognition piece and move into that word learning piece. So teaching morphemes really opens up lots of word knowledge, or a whole storehouse of words for students. And it really can enhance vocabulary learning and increase their word knowledge exponentially as we go through. So we're going to again see a short video example of some quick morpheme instruction in a third grade classroom.
During a read aloud, I have a goal or a strategy that I'm planning to teach. And once I model and I have some participation from the students, the goal is that they will go back to their seats with their choice book and use that same strategy to build on comprehension. In today's lesson, I'm going to reread parts of the story, The Statue of Liberty. I'm going to help the children notice word parts of unfamiliar words. I'm going to stop on a couple of pages and point out some tricky words that may be unfamiliar to the children and break apart their word parts and make some connections between new words and words they already know. The work on the island went on, and soon the pedestal was completed. Piece by piece, the skeleton was raised. Then the copper skin was riveted in place. Liberty was put back together like a giant puzzle. The statue had been built not once, but twice. So the word that we're looking at is pedestal. This is our word for today. When you take a look at pedestal, are there any other words that start the same?
Pedestrian.
Pedestrian.
Fancy.
I know. What's a pedestrian?
Somebody who's walking.
Someone who's walking. Any others?
Pedal. Pedicure.
Pedicure. What do these three words have in common? Like, what do we notice here?
PED.
P-E-D. And P-E-D says
Ped.
yes. So we have P-E-D. Do we know what P-E-D means? Like the root word, what it means? Think about this. A pedicure is done on your
Feet. Oh.
okay? When you pedal,
You
use your,
feet.
if you're a pedestrian, you are,
Walking.
so you're using your,
Feet.
so then we could probably conclude that ped is the root word for foot. So the pedestal is the foot or the base that the Statue of Liberty sits on.
Okay, and again, the power of that video is the classroom discussion that's occurring. So the last principle that we're going to talk about before I turn this over to Kelly is involving students in identifying words to be studied. So here's just a very quick example of having them, giving them some ownership in words that they want to learn or explore more about, become a vocabulary hotshot. So it just ensures that ongoing vocabulary learning to motivate that interest in words, and just provides that place to record target words and encourage that independent learning of words that they find particularly fascinating or interesting. And this strategy came directly from the teaching reading source book from Core Learning, if you're interested, and most folks have access to that book. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, and she's going to talk about some effective implementation and how you can support your teachers in making connections from letters.
Thanks, Cynthia. So what we're really going to focus on in this section of our presentation today is supporting teachers through the bridge to practice activities and how those connect to the professional teaching standards, as well as taking a dive into what that great vocabulary instruction looks like in the classroom. The content and everything we're going to look at in this section is really aligning to that Volume 2, Unit 5 oral vocabulary. So we'll be looking at the beginning of Volume 2, right? Because we're kind of shifting over to that oral language and vocabulary and language comprehension side. The thing that you might notice is Cohort 1 folks, you might already have seen some of these practices happening in your buildings, whereas Cohort 2 folks maybe just be getting to this point, and Cohort 3 folks just might not be here yet. So let's move on, and we're going to talk really quickly about our connections to the Letters PLC guide. And we're, like I said, we're really going to focus on the bridge to practice piece, because I know you've, if you've been with us in other sessions, you've seen some of the other pieces featured already. Remember, Volume 1 and 2 PLC guides are linked in the Padlet. The Volume 2 PLC guide is completed through Unit 6 right now. And one thing to think about is if you don't have extended PLC time, you probably can't do all of this at once. So you could think about it more like a choice board and consider what additional time you can pull some of the pieces in. Like it could be a faculty meeting instead of a PLC meeting. And then during our last session, Candace introduced you to all 3 components of the PLC guide. So we looked at the overview of learning section, and that's the review of the content that the teachers have seen in their letters reading and in their online sections. And then we also looked at the application and coaching for all section, which basically provides the resources that the PLC can use to model instructional practices and to really focus on what kind of coaching instruction is going to happen with classroom instruction. There's also a place where teachers can have a voice about the kind of coaching they're getting. But today we're really going to focus on that bridge to practice section that provides an opportunity to reflect on some of the experiences that teachers are having as they're implementing new practices in their classroom, and then giving them time to kind of reflect on that content and that new learning together. So I want to give you just about 2 quick minutes to look through the bridge to practice activities on pages 0 through 4 of the Letters PLC guide. And what I want you to be looking at is look at the instruction that teachers are being asked to provide as part of the bridge to practice activities, because it's that opportunity to practice that's the connection between the course content and changing instructional practices. So Angela, if you will start our timer. Thank you. So when we think about the bridge to practice activities, it's really important to think about the space that we're creating for teachers to think about bridge to practice, because it's a lift, not as a means of demonstrating compliance though, and like checking a box and like submitting that they did their bridge to practice, but considering how they benefit from those bridge to practice activities collaboratively. So the first thing I want you to look at is that the bridge to practice activity discussion piece. And that's where we have it out, the bridge to practice activity outline. This is from Unit 5, Session 4. And the big thing that I want you to take away from this is that these activities can be implemented during classroom instruction. Differentiated small group is a place where you could kind of expect to see these things happening. And it's important to be able to speak to the fact that your bridge to practice activities shouldn't be something that are different than good planning and teaching. The other piece of this section is the importance of teachers being able to debrief those activities together, because you're providing a space for teachers to talk about what they're learning and put that learning into practice. We're going to go on and look at the reflection of the lesson piece, because not all teachers necessarily intrinsically see the value of the Letters professional development. We can use this section to kind of use some questioning to guide teachers in thinking about their new practices. And again, thinking about that critical reflection piece where teachers are reflecting together to refine instruction and facilitate student learning. And this is really the place where as teachers are working through their own experiences, there's potential to really increase their investment in changing their instructional practices in the classroom. And then on our last piece is that planning for future lessons. This is really where we can think about how we're working together to integrate that content from letters and really validate the practices that either folks already have in place or identify practices that we want to focus on. Those collaborative foundations are so, so important to everything that we're doing. The next thing I want to look at really quickly is making connections between the letters PLC process and the teaching standards. But before we do that, there are a couple things that I really want to point out. So on this slide, I want you to look at the 22-23 school year. That's where we are right now. And we're going to outline that in yellow so it jumps out at you. But I want you to think about this as a leader. Even if you're in a cohort 1 district, your teachers are still learning volume 2. And you have to be able to learn something and own it before you have strong implementation. So you might see some changes starting in what you're doing, but you might not see everything that we've talked about in our sessions yet, and that's okay. Our goal is for you guys to get the background knowledge and kind of the exposure to what those big 5 components of literacy instruction look like in the classroom. And then that's where your work comes in, because the conversations that you're having in your building and the processes that you have in place for data and planning instruction and the resources that you're providing teachers, that's what makes the work really happen. The other thing is, even when the letters content is completed, learning's not over. Letters is not going away. Science of reading is not going away. We know that this is how students learn. So we have to have a process in place to support your teachers beyond just the coursework. So the North Carolina teaching standards actually were a commission that had 16 practicing teachers sitting on the panel, and they were identifying the skills that teachers should know and be able to do in North Carolina. And as leaders, oftentimes we think about those professional teaching standards as evaluative, but I really want you to come at them with a different approach today, and I want you to think about them as opportunities to support teachers, because we know that if we want to have strong implementation, we have to have strong leadership. So we're going to start by walking through a couple of the standards. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read you all of the bullets, but we'll start by looking at teachers demonstrating leadership. And so we want to think, if we're looking at our teachers demonstrating leadership within our buildings, we need to look at the opportunities that we're providing them, right? Like, are we providing opportunities to organize data and plan and set goals and work collaboratively within the PLC? How are we promoting professional growth? We know that in the letters PLC, we're asking teachers to establish trust and work collaboratively for the benefit of all students. Anytime that you work with data or practicing new learning, you have to have that safe space. And those collaborative conversations really open up those opportunities for teachers to work together and support each other and mentor each other through their new learning. When we look at standard 3 and we look at opportunities for explicit and thorough preparation and literacy instruction and using indicators to assess student progress, we know standard 3 really speaks to teachers knowing the content that they teach as that kind of content area knowledge. But in elementary school, it explicitly addresses literacy instruction. And we know that all teachers are reading teachers. So giving them that support through the letters PLC really levels the playing field for all of our teachers. And as a leader, you're the one who ensures those opportunities for support. So standard 4 and 5 is kind of where that letters PLC really lives. If you think about all of the background knowledge, the brain science, the reading models, how kids are learning how to read, that is where our teachers are making those connections and facilitating learning for their students, thinking about differentiating instruction and adapting resources based on student need. And I think most importantly, giving our teachers those tools through letters implementation to expand their toolbox to facilitate learning for all students. And then standard 5 goes right back to that reflection piece. Reflection is so important. And providing teachers the opportunity to work and reflect together when they're looking at data and when they're talking about new practices, that's really where you get that teacher level buy-in, because teachers are leading the change. So we're going to go on and we're going to look at some of the self-reflection tools for vocabulary instruction. And I really want to remind you, and we're just going to hop over to that next slide, Angela, trying to make up a little bit of time here for us. I really want to remind you that these self-reflection tools aren't evaluative. We really want them to support our own learning as leaders in our buildings. And then as we think about looking at what we want to see in vocabulary instruction, I picked this quote because I really think the language surrounding robust vocabulary instruction and directly explaining the meanings of words and then that playful interactive follow-up, that's exactly what we want to see in our instruction. So we're going to be looking really quickly at the vocabulary self-reflection tool. And I think we'll probably just look at this for a minute instead of 2 minutes. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at the first column. Candace has dropped it in the Padlet in the chat for you. It's also in the Padlet. I really want you to look at those instructional guidance, that column under direct vocabulary instruction. This tool is a little bit different because it has the direct vocabulary instruction piece and the incidental vocabulary instruction piece. We're actually going to look at both of them, but I want to give you, let's do 1 minute, and I just want you in that instructional guidance column, look for words that jump out at you that you might want to see when you're looking at vocabulary instruction. Okay, I know that was really quick. And we're going to go and we're going to look at a quick video. This is literally like a 2-minute video of Anita Archer. And I want you to be looking for some of those nouns that you just identified. And when we're done, we're going to be dropping the numbers of the practices that you've seen in the chat, okay?
Now, there are some words in this story that I would really like us to learn because we could use them all of the time. And this word is, let's read it by parts. The first part is con. What part, everyone? Con, and use the sound s. And the next part is sen. And the last part is trait. And say it really fast, everyone. Concentrate. One more time, everyone. Concentrate. One more time. Concentrate. Now, you remember in the story that some of the animals couldn't, what, everyone? Concentrate when the wolf was reading. Now, the word concentrate means that you are able to really think about something. You're able to put all of your attention on it. So when I really think about something and put all of my attention on it, what, everyone? I concentrate. What do, everyone? I concentrate. For example, if you were doing your math and you did one problem and then the next problem, and never looked up when someone came in the room, we would say that she knows how to, what, everyone? Concentrate. If you came to the library and sat down and you took out a book and you just read and read, even though he came over and she walked around you, we'd say, boy, you are able to put your thinking on it. You're able to put your attention on it. She knows how to, what, everyone? Concentrate. Get ready to tell me if this person in the pretend story knows how to concentrate. So you are reading in class and you just read and you turn the page and you read some more and you read some more and you read some more and you just keep reading. Does she know how to concentrate? Yes or no, everyone? Yes, okay? And this is pretend because it would never happen. So you start reading a page and then you look up at the clock and then you look down and then you talk over with your friends and you look back at the book. Does she know how to concentrate? Yes or no? She really does. That was just a pretend story. So once again, what is our word, everyone? Concentrate. Well,
so if you could just drop a number of an instructional practice that you noticed in that lesson into the chat so we can kind of see what we saw during that lesson. For example, one of the things that I saw was number 1. I see constant repetition, multiple contexts, abstract words. I see some 3s. I see some 2s. Oh, I see lots of 3s and 2s. Yep, those were on my list too. Thanks, guys. And I will say one of the things that you might want to think about is kind of previewing, if you're going to be going into classrooms, previewing those lists first and just targeting some specific skills that you want to look at. All right, let's go on really quickly and talk about incidental word learning. One of the things that you'll notice here is that there's no column for explicit instruction because it's incidental, right? Right? So what I'd like to do is we're going to go on and again, let's see. We're going to go straight into the video, and then when we're done with the video, I'll talk about a couple of the things I saw, and if you saw them, I want you to drop them in the chat too, okay?
Read-alouds involving child-friendly explanations of words within the text and revisiting of those words after reading build children's vocabulary knowledge. In this classroom, the teacher is going to focus on vocabulary during and after a read aloud.
Today I'm going to read the story Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. I really liked this book because there were many challenging words that I thought my students might not understand. So I went ahead and chose several words and gave child-friendly explanations, and I put that on the back of the book. So as I'm reading the book, I have the page number already noted and the definition already ready. We do read alouds every day, and so a vocabulary-focused read aloud is an excellent way to introduce words to students that they'll find in literature and nonfiction texts that they may not otherwise hear. Today, we're going to read Sylvester and the Magic Pebble by William Steig, and we're going to talk about some special words today as we go along, and then we're going to do some activities. Sylvester Duncan lived with his mother and father at Acorn Road in Oatsdale. One of his hobbies was collecting pebbles of unusual shape and color. On a rainy Saturday during vacation, he found a quite extraordinary one. Extraordinary means special or very unusual. It was flaming red, shiny, and perfectly round like a marble. As he was studying this remarkable pebble, remarkable is another way to say unusual or very special, he began to shiver, probably from excitement, and the rain felt cold on his back. I wish it would stop raining, he said. To his great surprise, the rain stopped. It didn't stop gradually, as rain usually does. It ceased, which means stopped. The drops vanished on the way down. The clouds disappeared. Everything was dry, and the sun was shining as if the rain had never existed. I choose words that I feel will challenge my students and they may not understand in regular comprehension. I use child-friendly definitions, not dictionary definitions, that are quick and precise and focused for my children. I wish I were a rock, he said.
So some of the things that you might have noticed in that chat were that students had the opportunity to listen to high quality read alouds, which is number 7 on your sheet. I also noticed number 8, they had the opportunity to hear robust oral language. And the teacher was also fostering word consciousness by reading aloud to students, which is number 11 on your sheet. So again, the importance of read alouds cannot be overstated. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Albaugh to finish us out.
All right, we're going to do a quick wrap here. You guys, we keep coming back to this. We want to keep you focused on the fact that across all of these webinars, the literacy leader in that school is that building principal. You're leading what happens in that school building, and you create that enabling context that allows those teachers to feel that success as they're implementing. We've given you a lot of tools. We're going to bring you back to, on the next slide, the ALF. It's a tool we've shared with you prior if you've been in these webinars. That ALF is available as admins. If you've gone through your principal training, you've seen that. If you did that already beginning of year, just like we do BOY, MOY, EOY, you want to see progress over time. So it's an opportunity now. Bring your team back together. We've encouraged you all to have a team. Bring that team back together. Go back through these indicators. See how you rate yourself at this point and identify some areas of growth for celebration. So with that, we're going to take a real quick look. Just look for progress. Have opportunities for celebration. We know that teachers are embedding these practices within their classroom. We want to make sure, and this is just one indicator on this slide from the ALF on page 25, that differentiated Tier 1 core literacy instruction. Again, we know that many of you are working to ensure that core instruction is strengthened as you build, supplemental supports and intensive kinds of supports to make sure that all children are getting the things that they need. And the next slide, we're going to take a quick opportunity. And, when you think about walking through your building, most of us in this webinar today are building admins. The largest percentage of people who responded at the poll at the beginning were building level principals. So when you're walking through a classroom, whether you're a building level leader or a district level leader, what types of things do you often observe teachers doing to support vocabulary learning? Yeah, I see. Okay, very good. That prior model. Amen, Angela. Yeah, listen, and we're going to continue, and that's graphic organizers, all of those things. Absolutely. A lot of repetition. Thanks for that, y'all. Absolutely. Concept maps. Thanks, Lisa. examples beyond that text. Yeah. So this supports what you're responding there in the chat, supports everything that we're being, you know, embedding in our practices. Letters Volume 2, Unit 5, page 37 speaks to these items with regard to explicit teaching of a new word. You know, and I had to have my team kind of go through this with me because I know, you know, pronouncing that word, writing that word, and reading that word are core. That's part of that essential learning for that practice. So making sure that, you know, we're eliciting word use by students through that indirect as well. All right, so we're going to go on and think about that next slide. This is important. I want to take a moment on this, but I know we're nearing end. Many of you are already aware, these are supports that are being developed by the ELA team at NCDPI. We want to make sure that we're discussing key vocab, we're introducing vocab using explicit approaches. The literacy instructional standards, also known as the LIS, L-I-S, science of reading, and the standard course of study, those content standards, help educators and ensure that students meet the demands of the standard course of study. So if you're not familiar with the LIS, bookmark that link, talk about it with your team. You have that team at the building level, you have a team at the district level. Talk about how that fits with what you're already doing. The ELA team at NCDPI is providing professional learning resources and support for curriculum and instruction as it relates to the literacy instructional standards. All right, once again, you see the Padlet here on the slide. We want to make sure that you're using that Padlet and those resources are available to you. This has been recorded. The recording will be posted to Padlet. Next slide, we're going to talk about next time, March 7th. Bookmark your calendar for that one. Comprehension and fluency are up next, March 7th. Get registered. And finally, we don't want to neglect our pre-K folks that are out there leading the good work that's happening in pre-K learning environments. There's a webinar series for that. Sign up for that. We provided that link as well. We encourage you to reach out to your consultants if you need additional support in any way. And here's the team that provided this webinar for you today. Once again, we wish you well. Have a great afternoon.